The little black girl texted the biker as dozens of engines formed a silent perimeter around the entire plaza. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a late afternoon when the sound of the buzzing city street began to fade away, replaced by the hum of anxious energy. A young girl, no older than 10, sat on a bench just outside the bustling plaza. Her braids were messy from the wind, and her tear-streaked face was filled with a mix of fear and determination. She was alone. Her heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder at the crowd, her small hands trembling as she gripped her phone. She had one shot at this. With a deep breath, she typed out a quick message, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Please help me, they took my brother. She hit send. Seconds felt like hours. The plaza around her was filled with the usual noise of people shopping, chatting, and going about their business. But to her, everything felt distant, like she was trapped in a bubble that separated her from the rest of the world. She had been waiting for this moment, for someone, anyone, to come. Her brother had been taken by two men who appeared out of nowhere. She didn't know who they were, but they were cold and threatening, dragging her brother away without a word. Her eyes flicked nervously to the parking lot, where a silver SUV sped away, its tinted windows hiding the faces of the kidnappers. She could still hear her brother's screams echoing in her mind. She had tried to stop them. She had tried to hold onto his arm, but they were too strong. Now, the only thing left to do was send a message. She had no idea who would get it, but she knew one thing for certain. She needed help, and she needed it fast. What she didn't know was that, on the other side of town, a biker named Jack Forge had just received her message. Jack, a member of the Thunderwolves motorcycle club, had seen his fair share of danger in his life, but nothing had prepared him for this. He read the message, his hands tightening around his phone. They took my brother. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a call to action. Jack knew exactly what that meant. The girl's father had been a close friend of his, a man he had promised to protect. A promise Jack had never broken, even after his friend's death. Without hesitation, he tapped out a message to the rest of the Thunderwolves. Maya needs us. We move now. This is family. Within minutes, the response flooded in. It wasn't just a few riders, it was 100. The engines roared to life as the bikers, like a machine, began their journey to the plaza. The message had been received. There was no turning back now. They would stop at nothing to make sure the little girl's brother was safe. The ride was on. As the bikers began to converge on the plaza, a wall of motorcycles formed silently around the entire area. The sound of dozens of engines revving filled the air, vibrating the pavement as the club surrounded the plaza. From the outside, it looked like a routine gathering of bikers, but for those inside the plaza, the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. The street that had once been filled with the noise of the crowd was now quiet. The bikers were here, and nothing was going to stop them from getting Maya's brother back. Jack pulled up to the front of the plaza, his Harley gliding smoothly to a stop. He removed his helmet, his steely eyes scanning the area. The bikers formed a tight perimeter around the entire plaza, their presence a reminder that no one messed with their own. Jack's heart was heavy with determination. He had made a promise, and now he was going to keep it. With one last look at the plaza, he signaled to his crew. The time for waiting was over. It was time to act. As Jack led the Thunderwolves motorcycle club into the plaza, the engines rumbled like a thunderstorm, filling the air with their deep growl. The sound of the bike's engines echoed off the buildings, reverberating through the streets like a warning. The bikers moved swiftly, and their formation was flawless. Every member of the club had one thing on their mind, getting Maya's brother back. Jack's eyes scanned the plaza, locking onto the silver SUV parked near the far side. He could see the faint silhouette of a man standing by the vehicle, but he didn't recognize him. He knew this was just the beginning of a long fight, but he also knew one thing for certain. No one was leaving here without that kid. Jack took a deep breath, his hand gripping the handle of his motorcycle. The familiar weight of his leather jacket settled around him like a second skin. This was his family, and no one messed with his family. He gave a quick nod to his crew. It was time. The bikers dismounted with synchronized precision, and within moments, the plaza was surrounded. They stood in silence, the air thick with tension. The crowd in the plaza had started to notice the biker gang, their curious eyes darting back and forth as they whispered among themselves. But none of them dared to approach. They knew who these men were, and they knew better than to challenge them. The street was alive with the sound of whispers and murmurs as Jack and his crew moved through the crowd. The bikers' heavy boots made soft thuds on the concrete, a constant reminder of their presence. Jack's mind was racing. He had seen things in his life that made his blood run cold, but nothing had prepared him for the moment he stood in now. Maya's brother had been taken by force, and her stepfather was a cop. This wasn't just any rescue mission. This was a battle against the system. As Jack made his way toward the SUV, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his resolve was stronger than ever. No one was getting past him. No one was taking that kid. The steps toward the SUV felt like they stretched for miles, each step heavier than the last. Jack's eyes narrowed as he got closer. He could now make out the features of the man standing next to the vehicle. His face was familiar, but Jack couldn't place it. Something about him made Jack uneasy. The man stood with his arms crossed, his posture rigid, like he was ready to fight. But Jack wasn't here to fight. He was here to protect. He was here to do what he had promised all those years ago. Jack stopped just a few feet from the man, his eyes locked onto his. "Where's the kid?" Jack's voice was low and steady, but the tension in the air made it clear that this was no ordinary conversation. The man didn't respond at first, his eyes flicking nervously to the side. Jack didn't wait for him to speak. "I said, where's the kid?" The man's gaze hardened, and Jack could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "He's inside," the man muttered, barely above a whisper. Jack nodded and turned to his crew. "Stay here," he ordered. "Keep an eye on the plaza. We don't want anyone interfering." Jack moved toward the door of the SUV, his steps measured and deliberate. The man tried to step in front of him, but Jack's hand shot out, grabbing his arm and gently pushing him aside. "Not today," Jack said, his voice thick with authority. The man didn't protest. He simply stepped back, knowing better than to challenge Jack. The door to the SUV creaked open, and Jack stepped inside. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of stale cigarettes, and something else, something dark. He scanned the interior quickly, his eyes darting from corner to corner. And then he saw him. Maya's brother, no older than 7, was curled up in the back seat, his face pale and covered in bruises. He looked up at Jack, his wide eyes filled with fear. Jack's heart clenched at the sight. He moved quickly, kneeling beside the boy. "Hey, kid," Jack said softly, his voice warm and reassuring. "We're here to get you out of here. You're safe now." The boy didn't respond at first, but Jack could see the tiniest flicker of relief in his eyes. He gently scooped the boy into his arms, careful not to hurt him. He stood up, his resolve unwavering. "Let's go," he said to his crew, who were waiting outside. The bikers had formed a protective barrier around the SUV, making sure no one would interfere. As Jack stepped out of the vehicle, he felt the weight of the moment sink in. He had kept his promise. Maya's brother was safe, but the battle was far from over. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Jack and his crew were ready. They were a family, and they would do whatever it took to protect their own. Jack looked around at his brothers and sisters in the club, each one standing tall and strong, their loyalty unbreakable. "Let's ride," Jack said, his voice filled with determination. The Thunderwolves Motorcycle Club was ready for whatever came next. As Jack and his crew rode through the streets, the sound of their engines cutting through the air was deafening. The once peaceful town had been disrupted by the roaring thunder of the Thunderwolves Motorcycle Club. They had taken control of the plaza, making sure no one could get in their way. But that was just the beginning. Jack glanced over his shoulder to see Maya's brother, his small face pressed against the window, still clinging to Jack's jacket as they sped down the road. The boy's body was stiff with fear, but his eyes held a glimmer of trust now that he was finally free. Jack's heart tightened. The battle ahead was more than just about protecting this child. It was about standing up against the system that had allowed someone like Maya's stepfather to control the lives of the innocent. As they neared the outskirts of town, Jack signaled to his crew to slow down. They had made it out of the plaza, but the real danger was just starting. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the empty highway. The air was growing colder, and a sense of unease filled the air. Jack had been in dangerous situations before, but this one felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. The thought of Maya's stepfather being a cop weighed heavily on his mind. The man had connections, power. This wasn't just about rescuing a child. It was about taking on a corrupt system that had been in place for years. Jack's thoughts were interrupted when he heard a crackling sound through his radio. "Jack, we've got a problem." Bear's voice came through loud and clear. Jack's grip on the handlebars tightened. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "We've been followed," Bear replied. "A black sedan about half a mile behind us. They're not speeding up, but they're not falling back either." Jack's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Sure enough, a dark sedan was tailing them, its headlights cutting through the dusk. It wasn't a cop car, but it was too close for comfort. "Keep your eyes open, everyone," Jack said into the radio, his voice firm. "They're watching us. Stay tight." The group fell into formation, riding close together, their motorcycles slicing through the air in perfect sync. Jack's mind raced. Who could be following them? Was it Maya's stepfather? Or was it someone else? He couldn't risk the chance of being caught off guard. The road ahead stretched endlessly, but Jack knew they couldn't keep running. They had to confront whatever was behind them. "Bear, take the lead," Jack instructed. "We're not going to outrun them. We'll have to face them head on." The Thunderwolves shifted into position, their motorcycles roaring as they prepared for whatever was coming. The sedan kept its distance, but Jack could feel the tension building in the air. It was only a matter of time before the confrontation would come. As they reached a small town on the edge of the highway, Jack gave the signal to pull over. They needed to regroup and figure out their next move. The small gas station they stopped at was quiet, with only a couple of trucks parked by the pumps. The bikers dismounted quickly, their leather jackets creaking as they moved. Jack walked over to Bear, his eyes never leaving the road. "We can't keep running," Jack said. "We need to know who's behind us and what they want." Bear nodded grimly. "I'll take a look," he said, before disappearing into the shadows. Jack turned to his crew. "Get ready. We don't know who we're up against, but we're not backing down." As Jack scanned the horizon, his thoughts turned to Maya's brother. The boy had been through hell, and now he was caught in the middle of something much bigger than himself. Jack swore to himself that he wouldn't let this end in anything less than victory. The sound of approaching engines made Jack's heart race. The sedan was getting closer. Bear emerged from the darkness, his face grim. "It's them," he said quietly. "Maya's stepfather's people." Jack's stomach churned. The time for waiting was over. They were going to face this head on. "Let's go," Jack said, his voice steady. "It's time to end this." The Thunderwolves mounted their bikes, ready for whatever was about to come. As Jack revved his engine, he glanced over at Maya's brother, who was still holding on tightly to his jacket. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but Jack saw something else there too. Hope. They were fighting for him now, for his future. And Jack wasn't going to stop until that hope was realized. The road ahead stretched on, dark and empty. The sound of their engines echoed through the night, a constant hum that reminded Jack and his crew of the danger that was closing in. Maya's brother, still clinging tightly to Jack's jacket, hadn't said a word since they stopped at the gas station. His small face was buried in Jack's back, and every so often, Jack could feel the boy's grip tighten. He knew the kid was scared, but Jack also knew he was safe now. They wouldn't let anything happen to him. The Thunderwolves rode in perfect formation, their bikes cutting through the night air like a well-oiled machine. Jack's eyes flicked to his rearview mirror every few seconds, watching for any sign of movement. The sedan was still tailing them, maintaining a distance, but never falling behind. It was a game of cat and mouse, and Jack wasn't about to lose. He could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm. It was only a matter of time before the confrontation came. The highway was still deserted, save for their convoy of roaring motorcycles and the black sedan that followed in their wake. The rest of the crew seemed to sense it too, the quiet before the inevitable. Jack's mind raced as he considered their options. They could keep running, but they knew they couldn't outrun this fight. No matter how fast they went, the enemies behind them would catch up. No, it was time to face this head-on. Jack slammed his fist on the handlebar of his bike, signaling the crew to slow down. The Thunderwolves obeyed, coming to a stop in a dark stretch of the highway. Jack's heart was beating faster now. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. This was a battle. And Jack would do whatever it took to win it. The black sedan stopped a few hundred feet behind them, its headlights blinding for a moment before they turned off. Jack could hear the sound of the car doors opening, the soft shuffle of feet against the pavement. He didn't need to look back to know who they were. Maya's stepfather's men. The ones who had come for the boy. "We've got company," Jack said into the radio, his voice calm but filled with an edge of steel. "Stay sharp." The rest of the Thunder Wolves nodded silently, each one prepared for what was to come. They had all been in situations like this before. They had fought wars, survived the worst kinds of pain, and faced enemies who were just as ruthless as they were. But this was personal. Jack wasn't just protecting a stranger. He was protecting a promise made to a friend. A promise to keep Maya safe. The first of the men stepped into view, his shadow long and looming under the dim light of the stars. He was tall, dressed in black, and his eyes glinted in the darkness. He wasn't alone. Two others flanked him, their eyes scanning the group of bikers, sizing them up. The tension was palpable. "Where's the kid?" The man's voice was low, almost mocking, but it carried a dangerous tone. Jack didn't flinch. He took a step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You'll have to go through me first," Jack said, his voice steady and cold. The man's lips curled into a smirk. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man reached for something in his jacket, a flash of metal in the moonlight. Jack's hand instinctively moved to the pocket of his own leather jacket, his fingers curling around the handle of his concealed weapon. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he'd be damned if he wasn't ready. "Enough." The voice came from behind the group. It was a familiar voice, one that Jack knew all too well. Maya's stepfather stepped into view, his face hard and cold, a man who had always known how to control the room. His eyes locked with Jack's, and for a moment, there was silence. Jack could feel the weight of his gaze. The man was a cop, a powerful one. He knew the system, and he knew how to manipulate it. He had done it before, and now, he was doing it again. "You don't have to do this," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the full weight of his resolve. "It's not about you," Maya's stepfather replied, his voice cold and emotionless. "It's about what's mine." Jack took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "You're not taking him," Jack said firmly. "Not today." The man sneered, his eyes flashing with anger. He motioned to his men, and they moved forward, each one pulling out a weapon. Jack's hand went to his gun, but before he could make a move, the sound of motorcycles roaring to life filled the air. The Thunder Wolves were ready, their engines revving like a symphony of defiance. Jack's eyes flicked over to his crew, who were now surrounding Maya's stepfather and his men. The bikers were a wall of muscle and determination, each one prepared to do whatever it took to protect their own. "You don't have to do this," Maya's stepfather said again, his voice trembling with frustration. But Jack didn't hesitate. "We do," he replied. The battle was about to begin. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm ready to burst. Jack stood at the front of the Thunder Wolves, his hand still gripping the handle of his motorcycle, eyes locked on Maya's stepfather. The standoff had only just begun, and Jack knew this wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. Maya's stepfather's men were closing in, weapons drawn, their faces cold and determined. But Jack's resolve was unwavering. He wasn't about to let this man, this corrupt cop, take another life. Not today. The first move came fast. One of the men lunged forward, brandishing a baton, aiming it toward Jack's side. Without hesitation, Jack sidestepped, his leather jacket creaking as he moved, and grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind his back. The man let out a grunt of pain as Jack yanked the baton from his hand, tossing it aside. The fight had begun. The Thunder Wolves moved like a well-oiled machine, their movements coordinated and swift. Bear, the club's biggest member, charged at one of the other men, knocking him off balance with a force that sent him sprawling to the ground. The rest of the crew followed, surrounding the remaining men, their faces hard, their eyes full of purpose. Maya's stepfather stood frozen, watching the chaos unfold. He had expected this fight, but he hadn't expected the bikers to move with such precision, with such power. His eyes flicked between Jack and the men who were being overpowered. He stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side, but before he could pull it, Jack was there. Jack's face was inches from his, the intensity in his eyes enough to make Maya's stepfather take a step back. "You're not going to get away with this," Jack growled, his voice low and steady. Maya's stepfather sneered, his hand still hovering over his gun. "You think you can just walk in here and change things? This is bigger than you, biker," he spat. "This is about power." Jack's jaw tightened. "Not anymore," he said. He motioned for the Thunder Wolves to move in closer, ensuring they had complete control of the situation. Maya's stepfather, realizing he was outnumbered, finally reached for his gun. But it was too late. Before he could draw it fully, Jack grabbed his wrist, twisting it with enough force to make the gun slip from his hand. The weapon clattered to the ground. "This isn't your fight anymore," Jack said, his voice calm but deadly. "You've lost." Maya's stepfather glared at him, his eyes wild with fury. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" he hissed, struggling against Jack's grip. "You have no idea what you're up against." Jack held his ground. "I know exactly what I'm up against. And I'm not backing down." The other bikers had secured the rest of the men, making sure they couldn't retaliate. They had them pinned, the weight of their collective strength overwhelming any attempt to break free. Jack took a step back, his hand releasing Maya's stepfather's wrist, though he kept a tight grip on the man's arm. "You'll be lucky if the law doesn't catch up with you after this," Jack said, his tone cold. "But right now, you're not in charge." Maya's stepfather took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he looked around at the bikers who had surrounded him. His confidence was slipping away, replaced by fear. "You won't get away with this," he muttered, his voice trembling slightly. Jack shook his head. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low and firm. "This isn't about getting away with anything. This is about doing the right thing." Jack turned to the rest of the crew, signaling them to hold their positions. The job wasn't done yet. Maya's brother was still somewhere in the building, and they needed to make sure he was safe before they left. Jack's eyes flicked to the entrance of the building, the heavy metal doors that stood between them and the boy. "Let's finish this," Jack said, his voice resolute. With one last glance at Maya's stepfather, who was now kneeling on the ground, his head bowed in defeat, Jack signaled to the Thunder Wolves. They moved forward together, their footsteps synchronized, a force that couldn't be stopped. They made their way into the building, their eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he walked, knowing they were getting closer. The boy was waiting for them. They wouldn't let him down. Jack and his crew moved through the hallways of the building with military precision, clearing rooms and checking every possible hiding spot. It wasn't long before they found him. Maya's brother, still shaken but unharmed, was hiding in a small storage room at the back of the building. His eyes widened with relief when he saw Jack and the bikers. Jack knelt down in front of the boy, offering him a reassuring smile. "You're safe now," Jack said softly. "We're going to take you home." The boy nodded, tears welling up in his eyes as he reached out for Jack. Jack gently helped him to his feet, holding him close for a moment before standing. The Thunder Wolves had kept their promise. Maya's brother was safe, and as they walked out of the building, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. There was still work to be done, still people who needed their help. But for now, they had done what they set out to do. They had protected one of their own. And that meant everything. As the Thunder Wolves made their way out of the building with Maya's brother safely in tow, the weight of the victory settled heavily on Jack's shoulders. They had succeeded in their mission, but the battle was far from over. Maya's stepfather was still a looming threat, and his influence ran deep. Jack could feel the tension in the air, the quiet after the storm, and it made him uneasy. The boy was still shaken, his small body pressed against Jack's side, but the fear in his eyes had softened. For the first time in days, he looked like he might actually sleep without nightmares. The bikers moved together as one unit, their leather jackets and helmets a unified force that filled the parking lot. The engines of their motorcycles roared to life as they prepared to leave. "We'll take care of you now," Jack said gently to the boy, his voice low and calm. "You're safe. Nothing's going to happen to you." The boy nodded, his eyes still wide with a mixture of fear and relief. Jack placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder before turning his attention back to the rest of the crew. "Let's get out of here," he said, signaling to his brothers and sisters in the club. The Thunder Wolves mounted their bikes, their engines rumbling as they pulled away from the scene. As they rode through the streets, Jack kept his eyes peeled for any sign of trouble. He knew Maya's stepfather wouldn't just let this go. He had too much to lose. But Jack wasn't going to let that happen. Not if he had anything to say about it. The convoy of bikes sped down the highway, the cool night air whipping past them. Jack glanced at the boy, who was now sitting in front of him, his small hands gripping the handlebars of the bike. It wasn't much of a comfort, but it was enough. They were leaving the danger behind, and that's all that mattered for now. The sound of the engines was deafening, but to Jack, it was a comforting noise. It meant that they were together, that they were strong. He glanced over at Bear, who was riding alongside him. The big man gave a short nod, his eyes scanning the road ahead. They all knew what was coming next. Maya's stepfather wouldn't just let this go. He had too much pride, too much power. He would come after them, and he would use every resource at his disposal to do it. Jack's mind raced as he considered their next move. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan. They needed to strike first. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jack signaled for the group to slow down. The streets were quieter now, the neon lights of the city fading into the distance. He could feel the shift in the air, the weight of the impending conflict hanging over them. The Thunderwolves had been through countless battles, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about protecting a child. It was about taking on a system that had been built on corruption and power. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. "We need to lay low for now," Jack said into his radio, his voice steady. "We'll stop at the usual spot. No one follows." The crew acknowledged the order with a chorus of grunts and nods. Jack led the way, making a sharp turn down a narrow road that led to a secluded warehouse on the edge of town. It was their safe house, a place where they could regroup, plan, and figure out their next steps. As they pulled into the parking lot, the sound of their bikes quieted, and the group dismounted. Jack turned to Maya's brother, who was still clutching his jacket. "We're safe here," he said, offering a small smile. The boy didn't respond, but the relief in his eyes was undeniable. They all knew that the real fight was coming. It was only a matter of time before Maya's stepfather would come after them. But Jack wasn't afraid. He had faced worse, and he had his family by his side. The Thunderwolves gathered around Jack, their faces serious, their eyes determined. They had been through countless battles together, and they knew how to fight. But this wasn't just about physical strength. It was about loyalty. It was about standing up for what was right. "We move tomorrow," Jack said, his voice firm. "We hit them before they hit us." Bear nodded, a grim smile spreading across his face. "We'll make them regret messing with us." Jack turned to the rest of the crew. "Get some rest. We'll need all the energy we can get for what's coming next." The bikers dispersed, each one heading to a corner of the warehouse. Jack stayed behind for a moment, watching the boy as he sat on a crate, his legs pulled up to his chest. Jack's heart ached for him. He was just a kid, caught in the middle of a fight that wasn't his. But Jack would make sure he got through it. Jack walked over and knelt down beside the boy. "You're going to be okay," he said softly, his voice full of reassurance. The boy looked up at him, his eyes still filled with fear, but also something else, hope. "We won't let anything happen to you." The boy gave a small nod, the tiniest hint of a smile crossing his face. Jack stood up, his heart heavy but determined. He had made a promise to the boy's father, and he wasn't about to break it. Not now, not ever. Tomorrow, the Thunderwolves would make their move. And they would make sure Maya's stepfather knew that they weren't just a bunch of bikers, they were family. The morning air was crisp as the Thunderwolves prepared for what they knew would be the toughest battle yet. Jack stood outside the warehouse, his leather jacket zipped tight against the chill, the sound of bikes being prepped filling the space around him. It had been a long night, but the fight ahead would require all of their focus. They had made their plan, and now it was time to execute it. Maya's brother was safe for now, tucked away inside the warehouse with a few of the crew keeping watch. But Jack knew that would only be temporary if they didn't act fast. The time for waiting was over. Jack's eyes scanned the group of bikers gathered around, each one of them prepared for whatever lay ahead. Bear, the largest of the crew, was already inspecting his bike, his face set in a grim expression. The rest of the crew was checking weapons, making sure everything was in place. Everyone knew their role, and no one was going to let anything slip. Jack's mind was sharp, focused on one thing: stopping Maya's stepfather before he could hurt anyone else. The man was dangerous, powerful, and now that he'd lost control of the situation, Jack knew he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. "We move in 10 minutes. Jack said, his voice steady but filled with determination. The crew acknowledged him with nods, the tension in the air palpable. Everyone knew the stakes were high, but they were ready. Jack turned to Maya's brother, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. You stay here. We'll take care of everything, Jack said gently, kneeling down to the boy's level. The kid didn't say anything, but his eyes held a look of trust that Jack appreciated. He had promised to protect this boy, and he wasn't going to break that promise. As the Thunderwolves lined up their bikes, Jack could feel his adrenaline rising. They had no idea what they were going to face once they reached Maya's stepfather's hideout. The man was cunning and ruthless, and he'd probably prepared for their arrival. But that didn't matter. They weren't going to back down. Jack kicked his bike into gear and led the group down the winding road, the sound of roaring engines filling the air as they made their way toward the final confrontation. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows over the road. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as they neared the location. His grip tightened on the handlebars, his focus sharpening. Everyone, keep your eyes open, Jack ordered over the radio. This isn't going to be easy. We need to move quickly and hit them hard. The convoy of bikes sped down the road, the sound of their engines deafening as they cut through the quiet morning. Jack's eyes were constantly scanning the surroundings, his senses on high alert. They were close now. The hideout was just up ahead. The crew slowed down as they approached, the motorcycles moving in perfect formation. They were ready. Jack signaled to Bear and the others to spread out, each biker taking up a strategic position around the perimeter of the hideout. The plan was simple. They would surround the place, force the enemy out into the open, and take control. The Thunderwolves moved with military precision, their bikes creeping closer to the entrance of the building. Jack's heart raced as they neared the doors. They could hear voices inside, the sound of footsteps and the faint murmur of conversation. But Jack wasn't about to let them prepare any longer. He signaled to the crew. Now, with a roar, the Thunderwolves charged forward, their bikes kicking up dust as they stormed the entrance. The doors flew open, and the bikers rushed inside, their engines roaring in the confined space. The enemies inside barely had time to react before the Thunderwolves had them surrounded. The fight was chaotic. Bikers clashed with the men guarding the hideout, the sound of fists and boots against flesh echoing through the space. Jack moved through the chaos like a force of nature, his eyes locked on the man who had caused so much pain. Maya's stepfather. The man was standing near the back of the room, his eyes wide with shock as the bikers closed in on him. He had expected a fight, but not like this. Jack stepped forward, his expression cold and unyielding. You've got nowhere to run, Jack said, his voice like ice. The man's eyes flickered with fear as he reached for his gun, but Jack was faster. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it and forcing the gun from his grasp. This ends now, Jack said firmly. You've hurt enough people. It's time for you to face the consequences. The man struggled, but Jack's grip was like steel. You think you've won? The man spat, his face twisted in anger. You've only just begun to understand what I'm capable of. Jack's jaw tightened. No, he said quietly. We understand perfectly. With a quick motion, Jack knocked the man to the ground, securing him with the help of Bear and the others. The rest of the crew had already taken control of the other men in the hideout, ensuring they wouldn't be a threat. The fight was over. Maya's stepfather had been defeated, and the threat to the boy was gone. Jack stood over the man, his chest heaving with the adrenaline of the fight. He turned to Bear, his eyes hard. Get him out of here. We're done. As the Thunderwolves moved to secure the area, Jack's thoughts turned to Maya's brother. The boy was safe now, but Jack knew this wouldn't be the last fight they faced. The Thunderwolves had made their mark, but there would always be more battles to fight, and Jack would be ready for them. The sun was beginning to set as the Thunderwolves made their way back to the warehouse, the weight of their victory settling in. Maya's stepfather, once a powerful man, was now subdued and being guarded by several of the bikers. The fight had been intense, but it was over. The kid, still shaken from the events, was now quietly sitting on a crate in the corner of the warehouse, clutching his jacket tightly, as though he still couldn't believe what had just happened. Jack walked over to him, his heart heavy with the responsibility he'd taken on. He had promised to keep this kid safe, and that promise had been fulfilled. But Jack knew this wasn't just about keeping the boy physically safe. He had witnessed too many kids suffer from the actions of those in power. The boy's face, still pale with fear, reminded Jack of why he had to keep going. "You're safe now," Jack said softly, kneeling beside the boy. The kid didn't respond, but the small nod he gave was enough for Jack. He offered a reassuring smile before turning to check on the rest of the crew. The Thunderwolves had secured the area, but the fight had taken its toll. Some of the bikers were still catching their breath, but none of them showed any signs of slowing down. Jack turned his focus back to the man who had caused all of this, the boy's stepfather. The once proud cop was sitting on the floor, his arms bound, his expression a mix of rage and disbelief. He hadn't expected the Thunderwolves to show up so quickly, and certainly hadn't expected them to be this organized. Jack walked over to him, his boots heavy against the concrete floor. "You've lost," Jack said quietly, his voice calm but cold. The man looked up at him, with venom in his eyes. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" He spat, his voice filled with bitterness. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Jack didn't flinch. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," he replied evenly. "But I'm not afraid of you." The man glared at him, his fists clenched in frustration. Jack could see the panic starting to creep into his eyes. He wasn't used to losing control. "You're nothing but a bunch of criminals," the man sneered. "You think the law doesn't know about you? You're dead wrong." Jack didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the man, his expression unreadable. He had heard all the threats, all the bluster from men like him before. They always thought their power would protect them. But Jack had learned long ago that power meant nothing when you stood up for what was right. "You don't have any power here," Jack said, his voice firm. "You're not in control anymore." The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Jack stood there for a moment, letting the words sink in. He had fought for a long time to protect people like this boy, people who had no one else to turn to. And now he had won. But the fight wasn't over. He knew this was just one battle in a much bigger war. "Get him out of here," Jack said to Bear, who had been standing silently nearby. Bear nodded and moved toward the man, grabbing him roughly by the arm and pulling him to his feet. As they escorted the man out of the warehouse, Jack turned to the rest of the crew. "We've won today," Jack said, his voice filled with a sense of finality. "But there's more to be done. We can't stop here." The crew nodded in agreement. Jack could see the determination in their eyes. They were ready for whatever came next. "We protect our own," Jack continued, "and we make sure that this never happens again." The bikers all gave a firm nod, ready for whatever Jack had planned next. The boy, who had been silent the entire time, looked up at Jack, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Jack gave him a reassuring smile. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." As the sun set and the shadows of the night began to fall over the warehouse, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He had made a difference. And as long as he had the Thunderwolves by his side, he would continue to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The atmosphere in the warehouse was heavy, the smell of motor oil and leather thick in the air. Jack stood at the center of the room, his gaze drifting between the Thunderwolves, who were quietly gearing up for what lay ahead. They had taken care of the immediate threat, but Jack knew that Maya's stepfather's fall from power was only the beginning. The real challenge, the one that would take everything they had, was still to come. As the sound of boots against concrete echoed through the warehouse, Jack's thoughts turned to the boy, Maya's brother. His small face still haunted Jack, the wide-eyed look of fear that had refused to leave his features. Jack had seen that look before, in the eyes of countless other kids who had lost their childhoods too. People like Maya's stepfather. He couldn't let it happen again. The boy was safe for now, but Jack knew they had to get him out of the city, away from the danger that still lurked. "All right," Jack said, breaking the silence, his voice sharp and commanding. "We've got to move. The threat isn't gone, not yet. But we're taking control now." The bikers all nodded, their faces set in grim determination. They had already proven their loyalty to Jack, and they weren't about to back down now. Bear, as always, was at the front of the group, his massive frame towering over the others. Jack turned to him. "We're not heading back to the usual place. We're getting out of the city. We need a new plan, and we need to lay low for a while." Bear grunted in agreement, his eyes scanning the area. The rest of the crew was already making their way to their bikes, starting up the engines with practiced ease. The low rumble of the motorcycles filled the space. adding to the tension that had been building since they first set foot in the warehouse. Jack motioned for Maya's brother to come over. The boy stood hesitantly, his eyes wide as he took a few steps toward Jack. "You're safe," Jack reassured him, offering a small smile. The boy didn't smile back, but the faintest glimmer of trust was beginning to show. Jack placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get you to a safe place, all right?" The boy nodded, his grip tightening around the jacket Jack had given him. With a final glance at the warehouse, Jack mounted his bike. "Let's go," he said, revving the engine. The Thunderwolves followed suit, their bikes roaring to life as they pulled out of the warehouse, forming up in a tight formation. Jack led the way, keeping his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was still running through the possibilities. Maya's stepfather wasn't just going to disappear. He would come for them. Jack knew it. As the bikers sped through the city, the wind whipping through Jack's hair, he thought about what had driven them here, the corrupt system, the injustice that allowed people like Maya's stepfather to get away with so much. It wasn't just about this one boy. It was about all of them. About the people they couldn't protect yet. Jack's eyes narrowed. He had promised to protect the boy, but his promise was bigger than that. It was a promise to take down the system, piece by piece. The bikers made their way through the city, keeping low and avoiding attention. They were headed to a safe house on the outskirts of town, a place that had served them well in the past. But the journey wasn't without its risks. The city was crawling with people who would sell them out in a heartbeat for the right price. But Jack didn't fear that. They were too tight-knit, too loyal. The Thunderwolves would stick together, and that's how they'd survive. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jack signaled to the others to slow down. They pulled off the main road and into a quiet, dimly lit area. The safe house was a small building, tucked away behind a row of trees. It was secluded, out of sight from the rest of the world, and it was perfect for their needs. The bikers pulled up to the front, dismounting quickly and moving into position. Jack turned to Bear. "We'll stay here for a while," he said. "We need to lay low, figure out our next move. But we don't stop fighting. We can't. We've got a lot more to do." Bear nodded. "Understood," he said. As the bikers made their way into the safe house, Jack turned to Maya's brother, who was standing quietly by his side. "You're safe now," Jack said again, his voice gentle but firm. "We'll take care of you. No one's going to hurt you again." The boy looked up at Jack, his eyes still wide with uncertainty. Jack placed a hand on his shoulder once more. "We're going to make sure that no one can hurt you. You've got family now." The boy nodded slowly, his small frame trembling slightly, but he didn't pull away. Jack knew it would take time, but time was something they had now. As the night grew darker and the bikers settled in, Jack stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had made it this far, and that was enough to give him hope. Tomorrow, they would regroup, and they would continue. For the boy, for everyone they had promised to protect, and for the future they were fighting. 4. The sun had barely risen, casting a dull orange glow across the quiet outskirts of the city. The safe house, tucked away in a secluded corner, was still, the only sound being the low hum of motorcycles parked outside. The Thunderwolves had settled in, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. There had been no word from Maya's stepfather's men, but Jack knew better than to think the threat was over. A man like that didn't give up easily. Jack stood by the window, his eyes scanning the horizon, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the boy, Maya's brother, a child caught in the middle of a battle that wasn't his. Jack had promised to protect him, and he wasn't going to break that promise, no matter what it took. He had been in situations like this before, moments where everything seemed calm on the surface, but he knew danger was lurking just out of sight. His crew had fought for everything they had, but now they had to fight for what mattered most. A future for this kid, a future where he could grow up without fear. He had seen too many kids lose their childhoods, too many families torn apart by people like Maya's stepfather. That wasn't going to happen to this one. Not if Jack had anything to say about it. Jack heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Bear walking toward him, his face set in that familiar grim expression. "What's the word?" Jack asked. Bear gave a small shake of his head. "No sign of trouble yet, but we can't keep hiding forever," he said, his voice low and steady. Jack nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. "We're not hiding," Jack said, his voice sharp. "We're waiting. But we can't wait too long. Maya's stepfather is going to come for us, and we need to be ready when he does. Bear glanced over at the boy, who was sitting quietly in the corner, his knees pulled up to his chest. The kid had barely spoken since they arrived. Jack's heart ached at the sight. He didn't know how much longer the boy could stay cooped up in this small building, surrounded by strangers and uncertainty. "We'll keep him safe," Bear said, as if reading Jack's thoughts. "We've made it this far. We'll make sure nothing happens to him." Jack nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. He turned back to the window, his gaze distant. "I know," he said quietly, "but we need to take the fight to them. We can't wait for them to come to us." Bear placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, his expression softening for a moment. "We've got your back, Jack." "We all do." Jack gave a tight nod, appreciating the support, but still feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The rest of the crew was gearing up, ready for whatever came next. They had all made sacrifices to get this far, and Jack knew they were willing to go further if it meant protecting the boy. Jack looked over at the kid again, who was still sitting in the corner, his eyes wide but unreadable. "He's been through too much," Jack said softly. "We need to make sure he never has to go through anything like this again." "We will," Bear assured him. Jack took a deep breath and walked over to the boy, kneeling down in front of him. The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with the same fear Jack had seen in so many others. Jack gave him a reassuring smile. "You're safe here," Jack said gently. "You don't have to worry anymore. We're going to take care of everything. No one's going to hurt you again." The boy didn't speak, but his expression softened ever so slightly, as if he was beginning to believe it. Jack stood up, turning back to Bear and the rest of the crew. "We move out in an hour," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We're going to take control of this situation before it gets any worse." Bear gave a nod, and the crew began to prepare. Jack could feel the weight of the moment settle on him, but he didn't let it show. They had one goal now: protect the boy, take down Maya's stepfather, and end this once and for all. As the bikers readied their bikes, Jack stood in the center of the warehouse, taking a final look around. This place had been their refuge, but it was time to move on. Time to fight back. The boy needed more than just safety. He needed a future, and Jack would make sure he had one. The Thunderwolves rolled out of the safe house, their bikes roaring to life once again. Jack led the way, his mind focused on the task ahead. They weren't just bikers anymore. They were a family, and they were ready to do whatever it took to protect their own. Jack's heart was heavy with the burden of responsibility, but he had a plan, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. Maya's stepfather would pay for what he'd done, and Jack would make sure of it. The Thunderwolves weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for justice, and they would win. The Thunderwolves rolled down the winding road, their motorcycles a sea of chrome and black leather, cutting through the early morning fog. Jack led the pack, his grip steady on the handlebars, his eyes scanning the road ahead, though his mind was elsewhere. The safe house was behind them, but he could still feel the weight of the promise he'd made. Protect the boy. It had been simple words, but now it felt like an unmovable chain around his neck. The sound of the engines, the rhythm of the ride, helped Jack focus. This wasn't just about protecting Maya's brother anymore. This was about showing the world that there was more to this crew than just chaos and rebellion. They were a force for justice, for protection, for those who had no one else to turn to. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Jack felt the tension in the air tighten. They were getting closer to the heart of the danger, the place where Maya's stepfather and his men had been hiding. Jack knew they couldn't afford to wait any longer. This had to end today. The team was ready, every one of them trained for moments like this, ready to fight, ready to stand together. Bear, with his massive frame and unshakable resolve, was at the front, flanking Jack as they rode through the streets. Behind them, the rest of the crew followed closely, all eyes on the road, all minds focused. The quiet hum of the engines was the only sound that filled the morning air, except for the occasional flicker of a conversation over the radio. "We're close," Jack said into the radio. "Stay sharp." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. They could all feel it. The final confrontation was imminent. As they neared their destination, Jack took a deep breath and gave the signal to slow down. They were only a few blocks away from where Maya's stepfather's operation had been set up. This was the moment. Jack felt the weight of the decision pressing against him. The boy, the kid who had been nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game, would finally be free of the threat hanging over his head. But the cost of freedom was always high. Maya's stepfather wasn't going to just let this go. Jack knew that much. He wasn't about to let them walk away without a fight. "This is it," Jack said to the group. "We make sure he never threatens anyone again." Bear grunted in acknowledgement, as did the rest of the crew. They all knew what was at stake. They all knew that the next few moments could change everything. The bikers split up, surrounding the building that housed their enemy. Jack signaled for them to park their bikes in strategic positions, ensuring that no one could escape without them knowing. As they dismounted, the energy in the air shifted. There was no more room for hesitation. The time had come to bring this to an end. Jack checked his gear one last time, his eyes meeting Bear's. "We do this by the book," Jack said, his voice firm. "No unnecessary violence. We're not here to start a war. We're here to stop one." Bear nodded, his face hardening into the familiar expression of a man who had seen too much, but still had the strength to stand. "Let's finish this." They moved in, silent and efficient, their heavy boots muffled on the concrete. Jack led the way, his eyes narrowing as they approached the building. There was no turning back now. The door was just ahead, and Jack could hear voices inside, muffled but distinct. They were preparing for something, but they didn't know what was about to hit them. Jack turned to the crew. "Stick to the plan," he said. "No one gets left behind. We're in and out." Bear gave a sharp nod, his massive form shifting as he positioned himself at the rear, while the others covered the front and sides. Jack stepped forward and kicked open the door. It swung wide, revealing a dimly lit room filled with a few of Maya's stepfather's men. They froze, surprised by the sudden intrusion. Jack didn't waste time. He moved swiftly, his eyes locking on the men who stood between him and his goal. "Move aside," Jack growled, his voice cutting through the silence. "We're here for him." The men hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but that moment of hesitation was all Jack needed. He was already inside, and the Thunderwolves followed closely behind. The room erupted into chaos as the bikers closed in on their targets. Jack moved with the fluid precision of a trained fighter, disarming one of the men with a swift twist of his wrist. Bear and the others handled the rest, swiftly and efficiently neutralizing the threat with minimal effort. Jack's focus remained steady. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he didn't let it control him. The boy was his priority. Maya's stepfather would be next. The bikers moved through the building, room by room, clearing the space of any remaining threats. The tension in the air was palpable as they finally reached the back of the building. Jack could hear voices now, louder and more desperate. Maya's stepfather was here, and he was cornered. Jack took a deep breath, his fingers curling around the handle of his weapon. "This is it," Jack said to his crew. "Stay focused. No mistakes." As they rounded the corner, they saw him. Maya's stepfather, standing with his back to the wall, a gun in his hand. "You think you can just waltz in here and take me down?" he sneered. Jack's eyes locked onto him, his face unreadable. "No," Jack replied, his voice calm and steady. "We're here to stop you." The standoff in the dimly lit room was thick with tension, the air almost suffocating with the sound of breathing and the weight of what was at stake. Jack's eyes never left Maya's stepfather, who stood with a gun in his trembling hand, clearly panicking, yet determined. The man's eyes flickered between Jack and the other bikers, his breath coming in short bursts. "You think you've won?" Maya's stepfather sneered, his voice shaky but trying to sound threatening. "You have no idea what you're messing with. This city will tear you apart. You can't protect him forever." Jack's jaw tightened. The man's words didn't faze him. He had heard threats like these before. What mattered now was stopping him for good. "You're not in charge anymore," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. "You're done." The stepfather's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Jack saw the flicker of doubt in the man's expression. He was losing control, and he knew it. The bikers had surrounded him, cutting off any escape routes. Maya's stepfather took a step back, his fingers twitching on the gun, but Jack could see the fear creeping into his eyes. This wasn't the confident man who had once ruled with intimidation. This was a man backed into a corner, desperate. "You won't get away with this," Maya's stepfather spat, his voice filled with venom. Jack didn't flinch. "We've already won," he replied. The tension in the room grew even thicker as the man's grip on his weapon tightened. The bikers around Jack readied themselves, waiting for the slightest movement. They weren't going to let this escalate into something worse. They had one goal: to neutralize the threat and get the boy out of here safely. You have no idea who I am, Maya's stepfather hissed, his voice low. Jack's gaze didn't waver. I know exactly who you are, he said. You're a man who has used fear to get what he wants. But not anymore. The man's hand was shaking now, his resolve crumbling. The gun was still in his grip, but Jack could see that the fight was leaving him. I'm done, Maya's stepfather muttered, his shoulders slumping as the realization set in that he had no power here. Jack stepped forward, keeping his eyes locked on the man's. He didn't need to say anything else. His presence spoke volumes. The bikers had him surrounded, and there was nowhere left for him to go. The man lowered his gun, his head hanging low. Jack knew this was over, but there was one final piece left to take care of. He turned to Bear, who had been standing off to the side, his massive frame imposing even in the tense silence. Take him out of here, Jack ordered. Make sure he stays out of the picture. Bear nodded, his expression unreadable, and moved toward the man. The stepfather didn't resist as Bear grabbed him by the arm and guided him toward the door. Jack watched them leave, the weight of the moment finally beginning to settle in. It was done. Maya's stepfather was no longer a threat. Jack turned to the rest of the crew, his gaze sweeping across the room. They had all played their part, each biker following his lead, without question. They were a family, and today, they had protected one of their own. We've done what we came here to do, Jack said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of relief behind his words. But don't get too comfortable. We need to stay vigilant. There's always someone else out there, and we need to be ready. The bikers nodded, their eyes reflecting the same sense of resolve that Jack felt deep in his bones. It wasn't over, but for now, they had won. As the crew began to clean up the space, securing the area and ensuring no one else could cause trouble, Jack walked over to Maya's brother, who was still sitting in the corner. The boy looked up at him, his expression still one of uncertainty, but there was something different in his eyes now. It was trust. Jack smiled gently and crouched down in front of him. It's over now, Jack said softly, his voice low and reassuring. You're safe. You don't have to worry anymore. The boy said nothing, but his eyes shone with the faintest glimmer of hope. Jack reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We'll get you out of here, Jack promised. You're not alone anymore. The boy finally nodded, his lips trembling slightly, but his expression more at ease than it had been since they first met. Jack stood up, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. The crew had done their part. Now, it was time to take the boy somewhere safe, somewhere he could finally start to heal. Jack turned to the rest of the crew, giving them a silent nod. They had one last mission to complete, getting Maya's brother out of the city and into a safe place where he could start over. The Thunderwolves moved as one, preparing to leave the building and make their way to the next step. Jack looked back at the boy one last time, his heart full of both relief and determination. This was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like they were winning. And that was enough for now. The sound of the motorcycles faded as the Thunderwolves made their way out of the city, their engines a distant hum in the morning air. The first light of dawn touched the horizon, casting a soft glow over the quiet streets. Jack rode at the front, his thoughts a mix of relief and resolve. They had done it. Maya's brother was safe, and the threat from his stepfather was no longer hanging over them. But Jack knew this peace wouldn't last. The fight was never truly over. Not as long as there were people like Maya's stepfather still out there, using their power and influence to hurt others. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars as they rode, the wind in his face reminding him of all the battles they had fought and the ones still ahead. But for now, they had won. The boy, who had been silent and tense for most of the journey, was now sitting in front of Jack, his small body stiff but no longer trembling. The road ahead seemed long, but Jack knew they would make it. They had each other. That was all that mattered. As they approached the edge of the city, the roads grew quieter, the landscape more open. The crew slowed down, their motorcycles gliding smoothly through the calm. Jack signaled for a stop, and the bikers pulled off to the side of the road. The kid looked up at Jack, his eyes still wide, still uncertain. Jack gave him a small smile. We're almost there, Jack said, his voice steady. The boy didn't respond, but Jack could see the faintest shift in his expression. He was starting to believe it. You're going to be all right, Jack added. The boy nodded slowly, his fingers still gripping Jack's jacket. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a step forward. The crew gathered around, dismounting their bikes and stretching their legs. Bear, as always, stood by Jack's side, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The rest of the crew was checking their bikes, making sure everything was in order before they moved on. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few days settle into his bones. It had been a fight, one that had taken everything out of him, but they had done it. They had protected the boy, and now it was time to find him a new life. "We'll take him somewhere safe," Jack said, his voice low. "Somewhere he can grow up without fear." Bear nodded, a grim but approving expression on his face. "We've done good, Jack," he said quietly. Jack gave a small nod, but his mind was already on the next step. They couldn't stop. Not until everyone who had been hurt by people like Maya's stepfather was safe. The crew moved together, ready to hit the road again. They had a long journey ahead, but Jack knew that as long as they stuck together, nothing could stop them. They had made a difference today, and that was all that mattered. As they continued down the road, the city disappearing in the rearview mirror, Jack looked ahead at the open road, a sense of calm settling over him. They had fought hard for this. They had fought for the boy, for each other, and for a future that was better than the one they had left behind. They had made it this far, and Jack knew they would make it the rest of the way. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the road as they rode on, the thunder wolves moving as one, unstoppable and unbroken. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack was ready. He had a promise to keep, and he wasn't going to stop until it was fulfilled. The thunder wolves weren't just a gang of bikers. They were a family, and family always had each other's backs. Jack glanced back at the crew, then at Maya's brother, who was still clinging to his jacket, his face now a little more relaxed, a little more trusting. Jack smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They were going to get through this. Together.